everyone, and welcome to the Queerness Diaries. So, I'm your host, Connor Edwards, and today we have a very important episode because we're talking all about shame, sex, attraction, survivor stories of conversion therapy, which is a truly chilling collection of first-hand accounts from the most incredible voices. And with me today, I have the honor of introducing the phenomenal Lucas Wilson, or should I say Dr. Lucas Wilson, who is shining a light on these untold truths as its editor and as a survivor of conversion therapy himself, hailing all the way from Toronto, and previously the Justice, Equity, and Transformation, I can never say this very well, postdoctoral fellow at the University of Calgary. He is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, and you've got a very fittingly badass profile. You know, when I looked at your profile on LinkedIn and Amazon, I was thinking, how do I introduce you? Because you've got so much, you know, already that you've done. So for everyone out there, if you could, you know, give a quick introduction to yourself first, because you've got, like I said, the most amazing profile, and I don't know how best to sum it up.
Oh goodness, I'm just a scrub from Toronto. That's all I say. No, I'm a researcher. Most of my background, most of my research in the past was in literary criticism and intergenerational trauma. But I've since shifted gears and I'm more in the realm of history and religious studies as it relates to gender and sexuality, particularly in the context of the new Christian right in the U.S. But conversion practices, across the world. But by and large, my focus really is North America and more specifically the US, even though I am Canadian and I'm not, from the US. And I always make it a point to
Yeah.
clarify. But yes, I postdoctoral fellow and very excited to be here.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so excited to have you here as well because I think it's going to be really important today for a lot of people that are tuning into the podcast, having this conversation, no matter their level of knowledge when it comes to conversion practices, conversion therapy. It's such an important thing with being able not just to delve into your story, but also into all of the other stories that I always say you've done your job, even if it resonates with one person and helps them or one parent that's out there, that if you manage to convince even one person, then you've done more than these conversion practitioners have in trying to convince someone to be heteronormative. So if you manage to, with your story and with this book, convince even one person out there, then you've had more success. So, I think it's such a fantastic thing that you are doing for the community. So you've got to, give yourself a big pat on the back for that, first of all.
Thank you. No, yeah, it's wild that these folks, these conversion therapists, right? They make their entire living, their entire livelihood on the backs of queers and making queers quote unquote straight.
Yeah.
But like you said, they've literally never done it, so it doesn't seem like they're very good at their job, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
They should be going out of business, but of course, these practices continue. But that's what, again, in part, this collection is aiming to do, which is to shed light on the ineffectiveness and the bogus bunk science that is conversion therapy. And of course, it's not science, and it's completely just a bunch of ideology wrapped up as oftentimes in the garb of religion, but therapy, but it's simply not. And of course, it's a misnomer, and we can get more into that today.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think for everyone that's tuning in, no matter what their level is at when it comes to knowledge, there's so much that we can learn. But for those out there that are not familiar at all, how would you explain, so at its most basic level, what is conversion therapy and how as well does someone become a conversion practitioner?
So, conversion therapy at its core is an attempt to change an individual's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. So it's any, explicit or implicit, direct or indirect attempts to change someone into something that they're not as it relates to gender and sexuality. And so oftentimes within conversion therapy circles or within conversion practices, there are certain narratives that are used to convince someone that they need to change that oftentimes it'll be framed as, this is a sin, this is a disease, this is something wrong, this is something that can be fixed, this is something that is a problem, right? That your gender or sexuality, non-normative, of course, gender or sexuality is an issue. And so, there are different ways that they try to change people, and we can again get into the different practices.
Yeah.
But ultimately, this is predominantly a religious practice at this point. It wasn't always. It has its roots in non-religious or secular contexts. But the religious right, specifically in the US and Australia, and well, really the West, picked up on these attempts to change and these ideas that one needs to change his or her, their sexuality or gender in the 1970s. And it became, and this religious movement in a lot of ways really married itself with a lot of pseudoscientific therapies and therapists. And they worked together where one was the therapists, quote unquote, and again, everything I say is in quotation marks. That's the problem when you talk about this. It's like conversion therapy, all these words need to be in quotation marks, and the whole term needs to be in quotation marks. Anyway, so, these different therapists, quote unquote, were lending credibility to these religious folks, and the religious folks were paying for these folks' books and their resources. And so it was this mutually, beneficial relationship between the two that really created the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 movement, which again, by and large, was an American invention, but again, or a US invention, but really this is also happening in Australia, Canada, and beyond. And so what we're talking about today are conversion therapy or conversion practices writ large. But by and large, this really is a religious movement, and by and large, it's really a specifically Christian movement. But there are other, instances of conversion practices, like the book that we're talking about today, Shame, Sex, Attraction. There are stories included in there that come from non-Christian context, whether it be Orthodox Jewish context or there's a Chinese cult involved in one of the stories. There's also a secular story in there, but again, as the collection has a disproportionate number of stories coming from white Christian fundamentalist or evangelical backgrounds, that really is indicative or reflective of conversion practices writ large on a global scale right now. It's very much a conservative Christian effort, but again, it extends beyond that. Its history really extends before that as well.
Yeah, and I think as well, one thing that has shocked me is it's even in the UK, I did not know how widespread it was, because I remember there was a story in Spain, like living in Spain since 2016. I remember there was a big story that blew up in the news in 2019. And now in Spain, I think originally it was 5 regions in Spain that it had been banned, but I know it's spread throughout Spain now. But here in the UK, it's been something, and I was, kind of looking through some articles that there's been these promises that they're committed to banning conversion practices, but that was 2016, 2018, 2020, 2021, and still we're not any further along. And I think even if it was banned in a lot of these places, people will still try and do it. It will just be more discreet, but these practices probably still go on. Like I can imagine in Canada, a lot of other places, it might not be, well, yeah, it has to be under the radar, but it still goes on in a lot of places. So even if it is banned, it's still a huge problem that can only be, with the awareness that you're bringing with this book and all the stories, that ultimately has the power in trying to find those parents, those people that have these levels of shame that they're, putting themselves in these situations. But the conversion practices themselves, even if they're discreet, they're always going to kind of be there, aren't they?
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? So in Canada, it was outlawed. It's now a criminal offense to practice conversion therapy, and I always think about it in the sense that even if something's illegal, right? In certain countries, drugs are illegal. In certain countries, or certain drugs or whatever are illegal. But just because something's illegal doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Crime, will just go underground, and it's going to be something that continues. And oftentimes, if we're again thinking about the Christian context, right? Like that, so many times, what is conversion therapy and what is on a very basic and definitional level, conversion therapy is framed as something that it's not. It's framed as pastoral counseling, biblical counseling, whatever, therapy. But regardless of what you call it, right, it's still conversion practice. It's still conversion therapy. These are still conversion practices. And so, depending on the place that you find, or the place that you are, in certain, municipalities, in certain states, in certain provinces, in certain countries, it is banned, but it really, it doesn't matter on a certain level. Obviously, it matters in a number of senses, and it's symbolic, and it's good. And, then these crimes can be tried for what they are, which are crimes. But regardless of these practices being illegal, like you said, and, we talked about this in the beginning, or talked about this in the beginning of the book, it's something that is going to continue to happen regardless.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think one of the misconceptions as well is that a lot of people have maybe seen, movies like Boy Erased and have these preconceived notions of what happens, but it can vary so much and it does, from all the different experiences and ways. And maybe someone doesn't have to, be, I think a lot of people will assume that someone is maybe, sent or chooses to go away to this sort of program. And really it can happen, even in the household, it can happen with a lot of these ways that when it comes to conversion practices, when someone is just, trying to tell you that just who you are is completely something that we have to, if you want to experience, for example, a parent will say, look, for you to be saved and have salvation, we have to, basically change everything about who you are and go into this. So it's not even with a lot of these stories that the traditional feeling of going, to a therapy context is there. It can happen in the home, it can happen in a lot of places. And that's, I think, a misconception that a lot of us maybe have as well, assuming that it's always in these sort of traditional camps or places, but it can happen really anywhere, can't it?
Yeah, and you referenced Gary Conley or Boyer Race, and so he's actually the one who wrote the foreword to the book, and his story, right, like really did shine a huge light on conversion practices. It showed the world, that these are still things that happen. A lot of people sort of believe like, oh, conversion therapy doesn't happen anymore. It's like, well, welcome to a lot of our lives. It has happened and it
Yeah.
continues to happen. But the thing about Gary Conley's story, which is phenomenal, again, phenomenal memoir. The film is based on his memoir. Um, the thing about it is that it is one example of many, right? And what this collection in part aims to do is to show the variety of conversion practices. It's not always like Garrett's experience, and again, a lot of experiences are like Garrett's experiences at these sorts of residential programs. For him, Love in Action was the name of the program. Or, some people think, like you said, a traditional quote unquote, therapist's, office, or a lot of people think of like pastors' offices or, church basements where they sit in a semicircle and talk about, whatever, or Exodus
Yeah.
International conferences, or, these other sorts of conferences. And so those experiences, again, they are quite common, right? And those happen a lot. But like you said, conversion practices, there's a whole range of conversion practices, like you mentioned, that this can happen within the home, right? I think a lot of people don't realize how people's parents were their own conversion therapists in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah.
If you're trying to change how someone expresses their sexuality or identifies their sexually, or their gender, right? That if you're telling a young kid, a young boy who's sitting with his legs crossed, and you say like, oh, like straighten up, sit up straight, don't cross your legs, whatever.
Yeah.
And that those messages over and over in a habitual way throughout a child's life, these are conversion practices. And when we think about it in those terms, we really start to expand our definition, I think, of conversion practices. And I'm not trying to expand the definition to say like, oh, every single person in the world has
Yeah.
experienced, conversion therapy. No. But there is something to be said about how these practices, throughout a lot of queers' lives, if not every queer's life, right, that we experience messaging that does try to straighten us out, that does try to align us with a heteronormative model. And so again, I think that there's a good reason to reserve the term conversion therapy, conversion practices for certain folks. And I'm not trying to like sort of expand the definition indefinitely and just sort of make there's no distinction between people who went through an experience like Garrett Conley's or my experience, and those who didn't. But again, there is a lot to be said about how pervasive these practices are, and the intensity of these practices, depending on the context, really does expand, the category of who's gone through these practices or who's gone through conversion therapy. But all this to
Yeah.
say that the collection tries to expand this definition, right? That there's the familial context, there's the pastoral context, there's the therapeutic quote unquote context. There's all these different contexts, and again, there's stories from these different conferences too. But it's trying to show the range of experiences that we, in a lot of ways, we start with Jared's, experience, although there were, of course, representations before
Yeah.
of conversion therapy that were popular, more mainstream. But that's not where it ends, right? And I think the beautiful thing about this collection is that it gives voice to a lot of these folks' experiences who haven't really been represented before, and so it allows the space and the time for these folks to express themselves and to be heard, right? And for people to read these stories.
Yeah, and I think, as I was saying to you before we started recording, that the power in the book and the stories is that people have got to tell their authentic story without kind of putting that bow on the end, which we sometimes tend to do because, everyone's at a different stage of their healing process. And also, sometimes we have to say, this was a shit thing that we went through, and I'm not in a great place. I'm working to become better in the future, but I've been through a lot of trauma, and I think that's a very powerful thing that comes across in the book. Everyone is at a different space in their healing journey, and I think it's very important to have that message out there because, people can go on to live a very full and healthy lifestyle afterwards, but those wounds will always be there, and it's important to address them. And there will always be, I'm sure even you have it, like little things that will just set you off or things that you will remember, and it will instantly take you back to that time. And it's something that we can work on, in therapy and something that can improve on, but it's important to not minimize those things, isn't it? It's important to remember they're part of the journey and part of the story. And so I think that's a very important part that each of the stories have been able to breathe in their authenticity. And, that some people, yeah, that out the worst of it, but there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, and the stories, the majority of the stories do not end on a happy note in the collection. Some do, but most don't. And you know, I think it's really important that not all of the stories, and in fact, the majority of the stories didn't end on a happy note. And I think so often what we want, as I always say, hate saying as human beings, but like to make those like weird general or those crazy generalizations. But as human beings, I think it is true, and I stand by this statement that we want that resolution, that narratival resolution where everything's happy at the end.
Yeah.
There's a bow on everything and God's on God's throne. And so I think that what was important for these stories was not to end in that way, because I think that when they don't end that way, we are better able to see the violence, right? The atrocity, the damage done by these practices. And so, I think that for a lot of people, they crave that resolution. But the thing about these stories is that, like obviously we know because these survivors have written their stories that they're in a different place, right?
Yeah.
But do we need therefore then to tell everyone, oh, everything's fine now? No, like again, like the assumption is that they're doing well. But I think that for a lot of readers, it's important to sit in that discomfort. It's important to sit even second-handedly in the sort of like the uncomfortability of these stories, right? And
Yeah.
not to like secondhand traumatize anyone. I know that's certainly not the goal. But to give voice to what these folks went through, and for the reader to know that these people didn't just the next day wake up and all was well, right? That there was for them, this was their reality. They lived through this for so long, and so for a reader to sit through each story for every 10 to 20 to 30 minutes, however long it takes one to read the stories, I think that is an important exercise, at least in an exercise of empathy, and
Yeah.
to sit with the discomfort.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's very powerful as well when you imagine, maybe a 15-year-old is looking on the internet and comes across, and maybe they have one thing in their mind that, their parents and their beliefs is pointing them towards, to have discomfort and also be able to sit with each of these stories. And I always feel like no matter how much information is out there, there will always be people that you're never convinced. But it's like I said before, even if you reach that one person, that 15-year-old that is considering it and starting to look through different avenues to explore, to the parent that maybe they've already made their minds up, but somehow they get curious and something brings them to the book. You hope that, one of the stories in there is going to resonate. And even if it doesn't completely change their mind, that it might change their approach to what they've already preconceived is the way to go about this situation. And, I think that's the most important thing you can hope for. You could, if it reaches one person, hopefully it reaches, thousands and thousands. But even if it reaches, one lost kid that's just happened to come across it or a parent, then you've done an amazing job just with that.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm a pessimist. I simply don't think that the majority of conversion practitioners or those who support conversion practices will ever change their mind. And I also, highly doubt that they're going to read the book. But like you said, if it's one person, that's important. But on top of that too, it's like, if it's like you said, like a kid who's considering this or an adult who's considering this. Unfortunately, there are a number of adults who consider and put themselves in conversion therapy. But on top of all of that, really, to allow those who underwent conversion practices to read this collection and find themselves in the stories, I think that that is a super, um, not therapeutic, but it's a life-giving sort of exercise, right? I think so often, so many of us didn't have representation that gave voice to our experiences, and so when you see or read something that is similar to what you've gone through, you see yourself, and I think
Yeah.
that's quite empowering.
Yeah, it's so true. And I always think, no matter how different each of the survivors' stories are, there's always something that resonates in each story. So you always hope that that's gonna reach someone that's in this place. And I really want to go into your story as well, first of all, because well, like I was saying before, I've never spoken with someone who's been in conversion practices and gone through it. But I think for a lot of people, being able to sort of ask the questions that some of these questions might be really random, but I think it's important to just ask them anyway for those out there that have the curiosity. And so I want to kind of go into your story specifically, first of all, which isn't till the end of the book almost, but I think, it's very important that you were able to tell your own story as well. And how was it for you when you know, was it something that when you were thinking, this is something I want to put out there, that you knew, yeah, I have to tell my story? Was it difficult to, put pen to paper, or did it feel like it was just something, you had to do? It was like, this is the time, this is now, I have to get this out there.
Well, so it's funny because I actually first started writing about all of my conversion therapy experiences years ago when for the most part I was in Holocaust studies. I was in a
Yeah.
field that didn't necessarily look kindly upon folks who had Christian backgrounds or people might suspect were Christians. And that's just academia writ large, right? Like no one, it's not like street cred to be a Christian. And I'm not a person of faith anymore. I'm not religious, but I had on my CV, on my resume, that I went to Liberty University. Liberty University is the world's largest evangelical university, founded by a really notorious homophobe, misogynist, racist, blah, 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 Jerry Falwell. There's a direct line between Jerry Falwell and Trump to give you sort of an idea of what kind of school this is. And Trump actually has received two honorary doctorates from the university that I attended. So, and also so did Mike Pence and a number of other numbskulls. Nitwits, numbskulls, what is the term? Anywho, whatever, it doesn't matter. You know what I'm saying. So Liberty University. So when I first started writing about my conversion experiences, my conversion practice, conversion therapy experiences, I wasn't actually writing it other than to really distance myself from Liberty University. I knew that people were going to see on my CV Liberty for my undergrad, and I was like, dear Lord, I just don't want them to think of me as a Liberty type. or as an evangelical. And at that point, I just wasn't an evangelical anymore. But I had this sort of, as part of my track record, and it wasn't a cute look. So I decided I was going to write about my experience at Liberty. And the first thing that I thought of course, was my conversion therapy experience. So I first wrote about, my one-on-one conversion therapy experience in Queerty, an online queer publication. And then from there, I actually wrote about my group conversion therapy experience in another magazine or another online magazine, RVA magazine. And then from there, it just sort of spiraled, and that's actually how I got this book deal. The publisher reached out and said, "Hey, do you want to edit this collection of stories? I've read your work, and it seems like you might be the person to do it." So that's actually how it all came together, or started, should I say? And so I had written about my experience before, but the thing was, I was quite nervous that I was not going to be able to write about it in a really authentic way. I was going to have to withhold certain details, and I did for the first few times I wrote it. But not to say the first times weren't authentic, just that they didn't have the full story. And so for the story that I include in this collection, I talk about penises a lot, and and it's very different from how I, of course, write the introduction. The introduction almost has somewhat of an academic tone. Then when you get to my story, ideally or most likely you wouldn't know that it's the same author writing my story as the intro, unless of course you read who wrote it, and that's me. And so my story again, it includes a lot of really sort of I don't know how to put it, but like sexual details, spicy details. And that for me was the difference between how I first started writing about it and how I write about it now. Because for a long time I was quite nervous to put my name out there and write about these things in the way that I wanted to write about them, because I thought, oh gosh, like this isn't a good look for me, as an academic. But A, it's authentic, B, it's what happened, and C, I actually think it adds to the conversation than taking away from the conversation. And I think it's important that I offer all the details that I do. And so in the story that I provide for this collection, again, I talk about sex. I talk about this guy that I met in group conversion therapy. The story is called Gay Christian Speed Dating, which is exactly what group conversion therapy is. It's just like you put a bunch of gays in a room, once a week. What do you think's going to happen? And so that's the story is about half my experience in the group conversion therapy program at Liberty, and then the other half is what resulted in how I the relationship, if we can call it that, between me and one of the guys I met in the group, one of my crushes on campus. So it's not difficult for me to write about. I think for me, I've had the time and space really to process a lot of what I've gone through, and that largely comes from my research and my just going through school. I was a forever student, and then once I graduated, I'm a forever researcher, and so it's just kind of been me having the time and energy really to focus my thoughts and attention and feelings too, my emotions, on all of these things, and specifically my experience. And so for me, it wasn't too difficult by the time I actually wrote the story, because I've had a lot of time to think through these things and feel through these things. Also, therapy helps, right? Like I think that's always a benefit or a bonus when you go to therapy. You're actually better able to articulate what happened to you. And so for me, it wasn't too difficult. But trying to get the story as authentically rendered as possible, that's its own challenge. But for me, I write a lot about this, and when I write about my personal experience, I use a lot of humor. A lot of stories in the collection do not, right? Like a lot of stories are dead serious, and my story, and as well as a few other stories, but my story really does use humor, and I try to bring in humor to really show how ridiculous these practices are, right? And to poke fun at how silly conversion therapists and conversion ideology really is. And of course, this is something I realized years after. Of course, during my time in conversion therapy, I thought this was all helpful. I thought this was all good for me. I thought this was all beneficial. But once I got out of that evangelical mindset and outside of that evangelical system, and really started actually learning by going to grad school and going to real universities, I was able to really realize how ridiculous these conversion practices and evangelicalism writ large, how ridiculous these things are. And so It wasn't difficult, the emotional labor, but it's of course, for anyone who writes, it's something that it takes time and multiple revisions, but it was a joy to write in the end. But again, definitely uh, uh, to get from where I was to the writing of the story was, of course, a long process.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I also think it's a journey of letting go of that shame that these conversion practices are fueled on. And shame is one hell of a drug, when it's used in these ways to make everything about you feel like it's just fundamentally wrong on every level, to go on that journey to let go of that shame, be able to put your authentic story out there and also give that space for other people to do it. I imagine it's been a very healing journey, probably hard at times. You've probably been re-triggered at times. There's been, I'm sure, moments when reading these stories that have been really difficult for your own journey, but it's in the end, it's all about letting go of what these practices have thrived off. And, that shame suddenly is used as a power instead to get these stories out there at their most authentic. And how was it when you sort of started scoping out for different people? Did you find people were open at first? Were they hesitant? Because sometimes as well, what I found, even for example, with different friends that have had traumas, is that we tend to minimize our own traumas. Sometimes we put the humor in it. Sometimes we might just, at first, we might just go from A to Z with our story without all the details. So when you're trying to get, a full story from someone, how was that sort of process in sort of scoping out those people and in getting them to be comfortable enough to say, look, just put it all out there as comfortable as you are with sharing it.
Yeah, so one thing you mentioned a second ago, if we can go to that, and then I'll jump to the question immediately after. The idea
Yeah.
of shame. So shame is that which really brings people into conversion therapy, right? Like people aren't in conversion therapy unless they do feel ashamed of who they are. But it's
Yeah.
also the number one byproduct of conversion therapy is also shame, right? So it's that which draws people in, and also that which is amplified and the result of conversion therapy. And that's why the title is shame, sex, attraction. Oftentimes within these contexts, it's not referred to as homosexuality, or it's not referred to as, oh, I'm gay. It's instead, well, I guess it is referred to as homosexuality. Pardon me. It's not that they're but they won't identify as homosexuals, which we can get into that
Yeah.
distinction. But putting that aside, it's that they're not gay, or they're not queer. It's that they quote unquote struggle with quote unquote
Mhm.
same-sex attraction. So I wanted to point out that it's not same-sex attraction that people struggle with, it's shame. And
Yeah.
so it's the shame-sex attraction that they're struggling with, or made to struggle with, because of these again, the ideology, the theology behind these practices. But putting that to the side and jumping to the question about selecting folks and how I found them and also working with them. It was at first I just put out a call on social media, and I mean at this point I'm decently well connected with survivors, at least in North America.
Okay.
There are folks across the world who are doing a lot of really great advocacy work that who I've not yet connected with, and I would love to. But for in my context, a lot of people, I had made connections with, and so reached out to them, reached out on social media, had different folks who have bigger names than I do, retweet my stuff, and people started
Yeah.
submitting their proposals or their submissions, which was great. And so I had more submissions submitted to me than I did actually include, and it was a difficult process of choosing whose stories were going to be included and whose were not.
Yeah.
But for me, it was some people. They did want to offer that really large, sort of overarching, broad narrative, like here's my story from when I was 4 until when I was 24. It's like, no, we can't do that. Like that doesn't make for a good story, right? Like no one
Yeah.
wants to read like a quick skim of someone's life. They want to read a deep dive, and that's why the stories
Yeah.
really they throw you into these contexts for the most part. There are a few that are a little bit broader, but by and large, most of the stories just throw you into like the room. They throw you into I don't know, the phone call that they have with their parents. They throw you into the pastor's office, whatever, and it just is a deep dive, a really thorough representation of a very specific experience, or maybe one or two experiences. But with some people, they did want to gloss over their entire lives, and I think that that's an
Yeah.
easier way of saying, "Oh, I did the work. I touched on what I need to touch on, and that's it." And it was difficult having to say like, "Hey, let's slow down. Let's go into this, and let's really explore what happened to you." And so for some folks, that was a difficult process, and it was multiple revisions of going back and forth where they had to sort of deep dive into their experiences. And I think for some people, these were in a definitional and clinical sense traumatic experiences, right?
Yeah.
And so to ask them to recount that, to dig that up, it was very difficult. And sometimes it would take, weeks for them to get to the story. And then, however long it took for them to actually go through the story and really flesh out what happened. And sometimes when we have been traumatized, we don't remember what happened to
Yeah.
us. We don't have that recollection. And so it was for some folks difficult to actually unbury what had happened to them. But you want, for me, like my job was never to change their story in the sense of like, oh, content wise, let's add to this. If they didn't remember, they didn't remember. My job was to bring the storytelling abilities, how they framed and told the story, to the up to a certain publishable level. And so you're dealing with, you're interacting with folks, and you're interacting and holding their stories, and it's a we're very how do I say this? Our stories, when we are in our writing, it's very personal, right? And it's
Yeah.
something that you feel attached to. And when someone offers you corrections or critiques or revisions to your story, it feels like a personal attack sometimes. And that
Yeah.
was, never my, intention. And I don't think almost any of the contributors, maybe a few contributors, there were some conversations about that exact point, that it's not them, it's their writing that we're sort of working on. But you have to know that going into it. And so when I taught for a number of years, and so this was exactly the same thing, where if you're critiquing someone's writing, they sometimes it is, folks feel as if they're being critiqued, but making a clear distinction, it's not you, it's your writing, and let's get the story up to where it needs to be to publish it. It was a delicate process, but I felt honored that people allowed me to work with them on their stories and to
Yeah.
polish their stories. And it is a collaborative process. And so it felt like a gift to be able to do this with so many folks. And there are 16 stories plus my story included. And so to work with 16 different survivors was, again, it was an honor.
Yeah, and I imagine as well for a lot of people that just having finally the space to put that story out there, because after traumatic events, we go different directions. Some of us have the dissociative amnesia where we just do not remember, and it's like the brain just switches off that part of our lives to sometimes you can remember something so specifically, like to the point of the smell of the flowers in the room, to what you had to eat that day. It can go so many different ways with um, traumatic experiences, but I imagine in finally being able to get the stories, out there, have that voice, um, maybe they've a lot of people might have, discussed it before, but to finally have it at its most authentic out there for the world is very powerful. So I imagine there can be a process, going through different nerves and all these things to get into peace with having your story out there, but it's got to be very rewarding for them now to be like, well, my story could help someone else, and I finally got to give a voice to the words that have stifled me for so long that I've wanted to put out there, but maybe it didn't feel like the right time, or it didn't feel safe enough for them to bring up in that moment. So I imagine it's very powerful now for them to finally have, them out there in the world, and it's going to help a lot of people.
Yeah, and you know what? I think it is helpful or like healing to write, right? Like so often when we talk about therapy or overcoming or working through whatever, we talk about coming to terms. Like I'm coming to terms with my experience. And in this case, we're coming to terms. We're coming to like terms or language. We're finding language to describe what happened to us. And for a lot of folks,
Yeah.
they've never talked about it, or they did talked about it rarely, or they only talk about it with certain people. But like you said, this is now a story that's, they're published authors now. They're now sharing their stories with hopefully, millions of people. Will millions of people read this? I don't know. I would love for that. But let's say thousands of people. And that is a big deal that they're able to come to terms and find the language. And, it is wild. One thing I didn't really touch on, though you had asked about, was sort of how the story has impacted me and like how I was, this was in part a healing process for me as well. And it was in surprising ways. And one way in particular was there was one author, and this is one of the stories included in the collection. His story, my word, it is so, there were so many parallels to what had happened to me in conversion therapy as to what happened to him. And so he's an Australian survivor, and he talks about, his story. He's on the road with this like Christian band and they're touring, and he starts recounting what had happened to him in conversion therapy as he was, in this on this like trip, this like whatever, like they were touring around Australia and performing at different churches and whatever. And so his story, part of what he talked about was when he would shower. Whenever he would shower, it was this moment of anxiety, right?
Yeah.
And I think about that. I forgot about this, but I think about it now. How often little daily things for us were made into big monumental things, moments of like panic or anxiety. And showering, I remember for so long, showering was such a site of anxiety for me because I thought, oh gosh, I can't touch myself. If I touch myself, I might masturbate. And then if I masturbate, I've sinned. And literally just doing daily things like showering become these like moments of crisis for those of us who were going through these things. And so, reading his story, it brought up a memory in me that I'd either forgotten or like willfully forgotten. Like, I don't know if my brain was protecting me, whatever, but like these things that you don't remember, and then you do, and you're like, dear Lord, like it's such a small thing to just shower, but for us, it was made into like something that was bigger than it should have been and never was. But we felt like the stakes were so high in everything we did. And evangelicals, everything is like of eternal significance. Everything matters. Everything, is important. So like, don't mess up here. Don't mess up here. Like everything, you have to sort of be perfect. And it's just this ridiculous way of living in this emotionally laborious way of living. But that was certainly the case for us. And reading this contributor's story, reading how he felt anxious just showering, I was like, oh my God, yes, that was me too. And so I think that, for those of us who are from these religious contexts, or again, for those of us who weren't, but are, queer, these stories really speak to a number of experiences that I think for anyone who's reading, you're going to see yourself somewhere in these stories, and you're going to see how, maybe your story isn't the same, but it perhaps in certain ways rhymes.
Yeah, right. I think it's very important that, that point about how when something has become kind of a learned action that you associate with shame, even though you have undone that process in your mind around feeling shame, the body still instinctively will register like something like it's wrong. So it's like you get almost like that fight or flight moment of being like, why am I feeling jumpy or whatever at this moment? It's something that's so natural, but when it's been ingrained into you over and over and over again that this is something to be associated with shame, no matter how much work you've done to undo it, there's still almost like that mental scar in your mind.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about the word trauma, right? Like the word trauma really means wound, right? And so you said the mental scar, it's a wound, right? This is something that, a wound, and wounds can be opened. And so for a lot of folks, like, what is it? Like Brene Brown, what does she say? She's like, the body keeps the score, right? And it's true. Like your body does archive these traumas. It does archive these memories or these moments or these experiences. And so, although we might not be cognizant of or like consciously thinking about, what happened to us, whatever happened to us, it's in there and it's going to come out in certain ways. Like all wounds are really just like, or all traumas are really just like wounds that are trying to, give voice to themselves and trying to articulate themselves. And when we do finally articulate them, again, that's when healing can start. But if we just bury them, then they're going to come out in perhaps like sublimated weird ways, but like they're still giving voice to them. Like these wounds are giving voice to themselves in indirect ways. And that's what trauma does. It comes out in indirect ways. But they're nonetheless giving voice to themselves, even if not through our, understandable language. But that's why I think the power of storytelling and the power of coming to terms, again, finding language or terms to give, shape to our experience, I think is really powerful.
Yeah, and I think as well, like there's certain things that someone has said to us in our lives that we never forget. I remember reading one of the stories, I think it was with Christian, and trying to conceal the aspects of his sexuality. Someone points out like the way he would walk, his tone of voice, and that's something that always sticks with you. Like I remember, for example, I had experiences with my own father, like when I was growing up through my adolescence with him correcting the way I would walk, my posture. It was always these little comments that just seemed like a little dig at the time. But 20 years later, it's like I still remember them. And at the time, maybe I brushed them off. These things stay with someone, forever. It's like at the time, we're maybe so focused on presenting in a heteronormative way that we don't realize that what someone's saying to us is fucked up.
Mhm. Yeah, and our bodies give voice to who we are. Again, sometimes even when we don't want them to. And I think nowadays, of course, I think for a lot of us, it's like, no, that's who I am. That's what, my body, my wrists are not that, firm. They're perhaps a little bit limper, and I'm okay with that. The fact that I have a little sort of like gay voice or a lisp, whatever it is, right? Like from when we're kids
Yeah.
and when we're adolescents, that these messages, they're harmful. But I think the beauty in being queer and being an adult, and again, having the time to sort of think through this, is that we can now turn that narrative on its head and celebrate those things. It's like, like those little gay things that we do. It's like, no, it's fucking great. Like, and
Yeah,
I like,
exactly.
when someone's authentic. And I think that, even if you're thinking in like a romantic or, whatever way, I think people who are authentic, that's what's most attractive, right? Not that I am quote unquote more masculine or I'm more, macho, whatever. No, authenticity is what's attractive. And that goes even beyond the sexual realm. That goes into just being around people that you want to be around. People who are authentic in themselves, it's wonderful that they are just who they are. And if you think about, for me, it was my brothers who would say these things about, like me being, I was like a dancer, I did like figure skating, like the writing was on the wall, like I was very gay.
Yeah.
Um, and now it's like, it's so funny that these are the things, like my creative side, these are the things that I'm proud of, right?
Yeah,
And
for
what you
sure.
find so often with a lot of these straight folks who are, policing us and telling us how we ought
Mm.
to act, you find out later on how much of a script they're following. Like they're telling you
Yeah.
to follow the script that they're following, but you realize it's just a script. You're just like, no, but like, I don't actually even believe that that really is who you are. I think that you're trying
Yeah.
to control your body and like, not move too much lest you, give voice to
Yeah.
something that you don't want to give voice to, or, if your voice is higher and you deepen it for what, all these things, right? These are charades. These are performances that a lot of people are following. And I think
Yeah.
for us as
Very
queers, I
true.
think what's so beautiful and a way to push against that shame is just to be ourselves and to be authentic in ourselves. And we realize that we don't need to follow these scripts. And I think that's a big part of what queerness is, not following
Yeah.
scripts, not acting, just being. And that's a radical act. And I think that's quite cool.
Oh yeah. It's so true. And I think, it's almost like peeling back the onion. Those parts were always inside us, but we build up these different defense mechanisms and these different ways to try and get through these situations. And we almost get so used to performing to shield ourselves from rejection. And it's like part of our adult life is then finding these parts that were always there, but they've been shielded away and kind of learning to enjoy them again. And I imagine as well with your story that it's ironic, isn't it, that you go to with this university, you're going into really try and seek a heteronormative life, but you end up, with these crushes and gravitating towards people that I think the irony in this is that, you find a group of gays that you would maybe not have found otherwise, and then they can, even though everyone is trying at that point in their life to maybe fix something or figure things out, you end up finding a lot of comfort in those people. So it's like, ironically, if that wasn't there, it would have been even harder on campus to try and meet someone and think, oh, are they or aren't they? And so by having them all together, in a weird way, it's like, well, I've met this group of people that I can kind of not confide in, but I also know at some level they're going through what I'm going through.
Well, that's exactly it. So, I mean, for those, who haven't read the book, What I talk about is being on a campus, the largest evangelical university in the world, and you're on a campus where you're not allowed to be outwardly queer.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to like act on quote unquote your sexuality. And if you are found to be doing these things, you're going to be fined. You're going to be, made to do community service. You might even be kicked out of the school. So all of the queers on campus are living in this they're living in queer subterfuge, right? Like they're not able to just be queer or be openly queer. They simply have to constantly, again, hide it, conceal it, and remain a secret. And so, like you said, the hilarious irony of this group is that you're not allowed to be queer on campus. Again, obviously there are a bunch of queers, and this group gives voice to the very fact that there were so many queers. But and then they're trying to keep all the queers apart. They don't want queers together because they don't want queers to find community. Because if they do, then right, it's a counterculture, and that could become its own community. And so it's hilarious that they make a conversion therapy group on campus because again, you have no idea who's gay on campus, but all of a sudden they put you in this hot, sweaty room. What the hell do you think is going to happen, right? Like all the gays are all of a sudden like, doing their thing. And I mean, for me, I really did do my best in so many ways, not every way, but in a lot of ways, I tried my best to become straight, right? I was told that if I was an evangelical, I could not be queer. So I did my darndest. Like I gave it the good old college try to become straight. However, I was also a hormonal teenager and young 20 something, right? That, who had hormones just like everyone else and a libido, just like everyone else. And so, although there was the majority of the time where I'm, trying to become straight, and I really did try to become straight. The other side of it was that I wanted to find out who were the other gays on campus. And so I went to this group largely to find out who the gays were. And it was, me and a friend, we went to this group after getting permission to go to see who was queer. But it's absolutely true. Like you said, like, it's just hilarious how stupid evangelicals are, how stupid these conversion practitioners are, that it's like the same thing with these conferences, like Exodus International conferences, where you're trying to get everyone to become straight, but then you put them all in a hotel, once a year. Again, what the hell do you think is going to happen? It's going to be a bunch of gay sex. And so I think that what's wild about that group is it's an anti-community, right? It's a community that is predicated on something that members of the group share, but it's also predicated on the desire to eradicate the thing that unites them in the first place. It's this wild dynamic, and it creates a lot of really weird dynamics between group members. Because again, you're again, like you're saying, like you kind of find community, you kind of find sort of solace in the fact that you're all doing what you're all trying to become straight, but at the same time, you're also attracted to each other, but you're not supposed to. It's this like bizarre dynamic that results. And again, I hope that in part this story gives voice to it. And also the other stories that give voice to these experiences in similar contexts. But it's an upside down world, the evangelical world. It's an upside down place, where conversion therapy makes sense to people. Of course, for a lot of people outside of Christian context, like you're like, what the hell does this mean? And why would anyone do it? But when you're in this system, it has a weird logic that makes sense to those who are part of the community, or again, maybe the anti-community. But again, I think that these stories really give like us, a window into what this upside down world looks like.
Yeah, I think it's funny to look back, when you see things that just seem so ironic now, like for example, one of the stories going to San Diego and then there's a pride poster in the hotel lobby. It's funny how life has a way of just when you look back and you just think, damn, that was funny. Like at the time, maybe you don't think much of it, but then years later, it's like, oh yeah, when I look back, it's like there were always things that were pointing me towards the direction of thinking, this is just crazy what I'm doing right now, or like, why am I here? Like, but at the time, it's like you're so immersed in the moment and trying to, find whatever you're looking to seek out at that moment that you don't think much of it, but then years later, it's like something that you can laugh about. But that's one of the things with trauma as well. I think being able, some of us eventually can find, from the most messed up times, something to find a bit of humor in. And sort of going back to your story as well. So I think it's difficult as well when you go into college and uni and you're meant to be, like a lot of us are at that time, hormonal, hoping we're going to find those crushes and dates, and you have this crush, but at the same time, it's like you are trying to fight with everything in your body to, lead this heterosexual life, but you at the same time. And I've got another question in a minute, actually, which I need to remember to ask. But I think it's funny how, you know, as much as you try and just fight it, like crushes just they take their life of its own. You can do everything to resist, but then life just happens. And I think as much as we try, it's like, especially, going into uni and college days, those experiences are what make a lot of it. We always remember those people that we had a crush on. It's like you mentioned, how looking up the guy on Facebook and seeing that his life has gone a different direction now. We always have those moments where, we'll go back years later and look someone up from college, a crush or someone that nothing may have happened with them, or they may have just been someone we briefly dated, but we always remember and wonder what happens to them.
Well, it's funny, like going to Liberty after I graduated and came out. I came out 3 years after I graduated. And, a lot of people unfriended me, a lot of people blocked me, all this kind of stuff, because, showing that good old-fashioned Christian love. And the people who didn't, like, and then seeing how their lives unfolded. And then also finding people afterwards, like thinking like, oh, I wonder whatever happened to that person. Then, they've unfriended you, but then going looking them up. I can think of one instance. There was this one guy on campus, like he was just gorgeous, like just stunning. This like black, thick, curly hair, and he
Yeah.
was like, super muscly. And I remember he always was always wearing like gym shirts and like skimpy like racerbacks, whatever.
Yeah.
And I talked to a friend, uh, who came out, well, bisexual, whatever, years after, and he told me that this guy and he would go to the rooftop of one of the academic buildings, get completely naked, and just suntan together, and like
Yeah.
there was like some like tomfoolery that happened between them, and they would sort of do stuff, but it's like, oh my gosh, like it's crazy to look back at folks from Liberty, because Liberty, again, it's this like super suit and tie kind of place in a lot of ways. Everyone's very evangelical, very religious, very conservative, and then you
Yeah.
find these like crazy stories of what happened behind the scenes and like what certain people
Yeah.
did. It's just wild to see, and then of course like the people that you don't expect to come out who come out, the people who you do expect to come out who don't and just stay in the closet. Looking at social media is a wild beast, and it really gives you a weird sort of like entrance into people's lives, and seeing what they put online. And so it's crazy after going to this school and seeing who I went to school with, and then seeing how their lives unfolded. Again, some
Yeah.
people's lives unfold in really horrible, terrible ways that are inauthentic, and some people's lives turn out really great. And you're like, oh, I'm super proud that you're doing you, and you're not following what you think you have to follow, but you're just being yourself. Um, and to actually give a story about one of the people whose whose life was perhaps a roller coaster. And I reference him in the story that I write about in Shame Sex Attraction. I would say like one line I say, there was this one guy who was a mutual friend between another guy I see in the group conversion therapy program. And in the original version of this story, I write a lot more about him, because in that original
Yeah.
story, I talk about this guy, and he was a good friend of mine who I met really early into Liberty, my freshman year. And we became friends. We stayed friends all 4 years. But in the final year that he was there, either that year or the year after, he was dating this girl for a while, this girl that we both knew, and they eventually got engaged. And I remember thinking to myself, "Holy guacamole! Like this guy's gotten engaged." Because the problem was is that he was gay,
Yeah.
and he had told me early on in school that he was only attracted to women. And so he got engaged to this, or sorry, only attracted to men, pardon me, which
Yeah.
wouldn't be a story if it were the opposite. But he was only attracted to men, and he gets engaged to this girl. He's dating her, and then he gets engaged. And I'm watching from the sidelines, watching from Facebook at this point, like, oh my God, like what's this kid doing? Like, why is he doing this? And then he gets married. And then a few years later, what happens? He has children. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is cementing, his place. This is the nail in the coffin that's keeping him, that's going to keep him in this
Yeah.
place. And I remember I had seen him. After I graduated, I went back to Lynchburg for like 2 days or something like that, and I saw him, and I told him, that I was gay, that I was living, out. I was no longer in the closet. And he was like sort of blown away. And at this point, he had been
Yeah.
married to his wife, and he was like, "Can I call you sometime and talk to you about this?" Because and he wanted to talk to me about this because, he obviously was living a life that wasn't, fulfilling for him.
Yeah.
And he never called me. And again, I wrote about this in this article. And so
Yeah.
anyway, fast forward till now, this year, it was January or March. I get this message where I can see he sends me a message on Facebook, a URL to the article that I had written that I talk about him. I don't use his name or anything. I was not trying to out him, but
Yeah.
he obviously knew it was him when he read it. So I see that he sends me the URL, and I'm like, oh my gosh, he's read the story. He knows,
Yeah.
like, is he pissed? What's he gonna do? And so I'm just like sitting there looking at my phone, like, oh no, oh no, oh no. And then the next message is, because I call him Gabriel in the story. His name's not Gabriel, but I call him Gabriel in the story, and he says, postscript, colon, Gabriel has left his wife. And I'm
Yeah.
like, what the hell? And so again, I had watched him on Facebook for years, seeing how he got, engaged, how he got married, how he had kids. And then
Yeah.
now finally, then he messages me. He's like, I'm not married. I'm done with that. Like I'm moving. We've separated, my wife and I, and I'm now out. And so it is crazy to watch folks, from Facebook or from online and see where they end up.
Yeah.
And in this case, it was great to see him leave that, oppressive marriage for both him and the woman he was married to. And they're now both living, arguably much, or presumably much happier lives.
Yeah.
Anywho.
Yeah. I think there are always those people though on that they have an impact at that time in our lives that we just always have that curiosity about. Maybe it's the what ifs or what could have happened. So you're thinking, oh, I just want to see where they're at now. And it's always curious to see how their lives end up. But I think for a lot of people that go through these conversion practices, there is, unfortunately, for a lot of people that do, go back to maybe that small town, or they've got the pressure of the family, that they then go into these marriages, and you can't help but always wonder about them. And I imagine there will be some people that do comment on the book and say, actually, you're wrong. I was healed of my affection towards same-sex attraction. And there will be those people that, despite all the scientific evidence, that will just completely disregard it anyway and be defensive. And I always think it's hard when you've maybe shared a moment with someone and then you see that they don't get, that freedom in the end, and their life doesn't pan out the way you hope for them, especially with those sort of, those guys that are sort of the what ifs that you just get curious about. I imagine, especially when it comes around conversion practices, it's hard to see them not being able to live freely when you've been on this journey where you're now able to be like, look, this is me. I'm not holding anything back anymore.
Yeah, it's always funny when you have those guys who claim that they're straight or that they at least are attracted to one woman, not all women, just one woman. And,
Yeah.
pardon me, or, I say that, that Jesus has healed them. And I'm always like, girlfriend, I'll see you on Grinder. You know what I mean? Like, we
Yeah.
know, like, you can
Yeah.
tell yourself as much as you want. You can tell the world as much as you want. No one believes you. I don't believe you. And on top of that, like, that I know that you're not telling the truth. Like, that's always sort of that, it's always funny because, like, as well as they do that they're not telling the truth. And it's sort of that mutual understanding that you both know. And whether or
Yeah.
not they, admit it, whether or not they continue to deny that they're queer, that they're whatever, that they're now saved by Jesus, um,
Yeah.
the truth, they know the truth, and you can sort of live with that, right? Like, whoever, wants to claim, that they're straight or that they're healed till they're blue in the face, that's fine. But
Yeah.
the rest of the world, including you, know that that's not true.
Yeah. I know. It's like it's something that maybe you see sometimes, there's people that have viewed your profile like years later and it's like they're curious about me still, but it's always like that tinge of like, oh, I just wish that they were able to have that freedom. But, there are, like I said, those people that do continue to have this pressure that they feel like of living this lie, and we can only hope that maybe one day that they have that freedom to finally be their authentic selves. But there's also stories in the book of um, some of these people have been in situations where they didn't even have time to react. There's one story about one of the guys that literally his sent off by his dad and all that toxic masculinity with kind of this burden of, look, if this doesn't fix you, then you're basically out on the street. Like the love comes with so many conditions, and it's like this thing that I find so disgusting, you need to take this away, or you cannot have the love from me. There's those type of traumas where you have betrayal in there as well, and the people that you've grown up really as your rock sort of suddenly almost you feel like they're turning on you. It's very difficult, I imagine, for a lot of people to justify like being able to have a relationship with that person afterwards, because I always think you can either live the lie and keep performing and just build more and more resentment, or if they don't accept you, how can you have them in your life when you know that they are never going to come around to, you know, even at the most basic level, accepting who you are. They're always going to have that resentment. And I think for a lot of us, that's where issues, maybe around betrayal, trauma, being able to emotionally connect with people can come from. Because when you've had that big betrayal by someone like a parent, it's very difficult to move past.
Yeah, and I'm gonna tie two things that you said together. You were first talking about how you wish that people could just accept themselves, they could just come to terms with who they are.
Yeah.
And then the second part, you were saying, you wish you could have these parents or these people who are important in your lives that they could again come to terms with who we are, and accept us for who we are. And oftentimes, or not oftentimes, well, sometimes, perhaps
Yeah.
oftentimes, these folks, it takes them a while, or they never come around. And I think for both groups of people, those who will never be able to accept themselves for who they are, and then those who are around queer people who cannot accept their queer child, their queer brother, their queer sister, their, uncle, aunt, whatever, for who they are. I think both of those groups of people are quite unfortunate. And I always think about it in the context of my mom. My mom, she's never going to be okay with me being queer. And I don't, to be honest, I don't really care whether or not
Yeah.
she does come around. Like I'm just kind of like, okay, like smell you later. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't care if you're my mom. I'm not going to try to convince anyone to love me. But I just think to myself, like for both of those groups of people, I think what's always been helpful for me to think about has been that you can't help people who are not willing to help themselves. So for the queer who
Yeah.
can't accept him or her themselves, you can't help that person. For the person who can't, seemingly figure out how to love people just, for the sake of loving them, I get the fact that that's somehow a challenge for them. I'm not trying to convince them of anything, and I'm not trying to convince the person who is saying that I'm going to always remain celibate, or I'm always going to remain, I'm a straight person. I just struggle with same-sex attraction. It's like if that's the life that you want to live in, at the end of the day, that is a decision, right?
Yeah.
The decision to be authentic, that is a decision. Same for the person who won't love someone simply because they have a preconceived notion or a weird theology or a messed up way of viewing the world, i.e., have a homophobic perspective. Those are decisions. For me to simply be, I guess that's also a decision in the sense that I'm not trying to cover myself or try to hide who I am. I suppose that's a
Yeah.
decision, but like it's not a decision to be gay, but it is a decision to hide it, or a decision to live a life of authenticity. And I think at the end of the day, those who make the decision either to reject themselves or reject others, I just kind of say like that's up to you, and I can't control that, and it's not my job to convince you of anything. it's your job to just accept either yourself or someone else for who they are. And I think that takes a lot more mental power, and it takes a lot more energy to be so closed-minded and just sort of like miserable. It's a decision to be miserable like these
Yeah.
folks, and I think that that's important. At least for me, it was important for me and how I understood again myself and those who didn't accept me. And now I'm just kind of like, well, smell you later. I don't need you, and I don't really want to be around you. Like authenticity is cool, and I'm gonna live my life, and you can live yours, but it's not gonna be with me in it.
Yeah. I think a lot of us have been, on those journeys when we come out and it's not met, in the best way with either learning to just accept that this is because there's always, I always find it interesting in different households as well after you come out and it's not met well, how it tends to go. For example, with um Peter's story, like he goes to away to conversion therapy, and then it's just not really spoken about much in the household later on. I remember as well with, for example, when I came out, it was not met in the best way. Like my mom, at the same time I came out, actually had just maybe a week or two before gotten baptized and really gone into the church fully. Like she'd always couldn't have been worse timing, but that will always stick with me being 16, 17, and suddenly she had really, immersed herself into the church Bible study, praying in tongues and all this stuff, which was already so far into what I'd seen for the first 16 years of my life, but also it happened to be when I came out, and then suddenly she was, you know, oh, do you want to go and talk about these thoughts that you're having with the pastor? And I'd be like, no, I don't know this. I don't believe in your religion. I don't know this guy from anyone in the street. Like I'm letting you live happily as you are. Why am I going to go for the sake of you to this place to someone I don't know and talk about my feelings that I don't want to talk about them. I want to be living my life and meeting a guy at college or whatever. And I think a lot of us go through these periods when we come out where even if you don't end up in conversion therapy or conversion practices, there's like that guilt because a lot of parents have that expectation that they had thought of how you should live. And suddenly just by being you, you've dismantled their whole idea of the life that they thought they were going to get from you. And so they feel like this sense of grief and loss. And it's like, no, I'm still here. I was always going to live, you know, how I was meant to be. But it's difficult when you first come out grappling with all those feelings. Like for me, it took many, many years until I reached a good place with my mom. And luckily now we're fine. But I do think of stories like Peter's, the emotional effect of being rejected, going to conversion therapy, and then it just not being really discussed, and that sort of feeling of, do you break away? Do you perform? You go back in the closet? People go all these different ways. And it's so important, I think, to surround ourselves with those people where we're just allowed to be our authentic selves, have that space to have someone to confide in whatever it is, to find those people. And yeah, I mean, there's no other way to put it. When we come out and it's not met with a positive reaction, it's crap. Like, and it's
Mhm.
sometimes it's good to just say it is shit. And for a lot of these people, unfortunately, when it's met with a family member or a parent, a guardian that takes it in such a devastating way, it will always be something that you remember. Even if you get to a better place in the relationship, you're always going to remember that moment.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, my mom and I had like after I came out, I was 25. I was living in Nashville, and I drank like a bunch of wine before doing it. But I knew that she was not going to respond well, and she didn't. And for about like 3 months, it was like back and forth, back and forth. And finally, I was like, wait, why am I trying to convince my own mom to love me? Like, that's
Yeah.
crazy. And I was like, this is just not the way that this is going to work. And so finally, I just said, like, no, I'm good. Like, if this is how you talk to me, and she said like really disgusting things. Like my mom, she has apparently a crazy imagination. She was telling me all the things she imagined I was doing sexually. And I was like,
Yeah.
dear Lord, like, first of all, who says this? Second of all, this is what you think of me? Like, what in the world? And so I finally was just like, no, like, we're not doing this. And like, bye-bye. And then she was like, oh shit. And then she lost me for about 2 years. About 2 years later, I came back and I was like, hey, let's talk. And so we did. And then we talked for like, I don't know, like a few months. And then I was like, no, I'm good again. Actually, I don't want to do this. Like, you're just, in that case. And I didn't talk to her for like years. And I haven't talked to my mom at this point this year,
Yeah.
since like January. And it's always the same thing, right? Like, it always goes back to like, you're gay, the Bible says this. And it's like, do you even know, like, have you read the Bible before? Like, I love when everyone becomes like a biblical scholar and apparently knows what the quote unquote what the Bible says. And I'm like, let's chat because like this is my academic background. I have, a decent understanding of
Yeah.
the field. I was like, let's tango, girl. Like, if you want to talk about the
Yeah.
Bible and hermeneutics, we can do that. But it's so funny, right? Like, it's so often people have no idea what they're talking about. They have no idea of the history, the context, like the interpretation, whatever. And yeah, and regardless of someone being religious or not, but again, if you ever have to convince someone to love you, to convince someone to be on your side, like you have to think
Yeah.
to yourself, is that a person I want in my life? No, it's simply not, at least not for me.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's, it can take everyone in the book has been on, so many different journeys, but when it is with a parent, guardian, that rejection does sting, and you just always hope, that it will turn out better in the end. I remember with my mom, actually, she won't mind me saying this either, but I remember that one of the things that I witnessed that it was an unspoken moment, but it was sort of way before I ever moved to Madrid. This is going back, I don't know, over 10 years ago. I walked in the living room and saw her watching Prayers for Bobby Ray, and I'd watched that movie on my own. And I knew in that moment that she was trying to understand. We didn't speak about it for many years later, but I knew in that moment that she was trying to, you know, to see me, and our relationship, even though we never spoke about it, started to get better after then. And then I finally came out again at 26 in Madrid. So, and when I came out again, I was like, look, I'm not holding anything back now. You either accept me as it is, or I'm in Spain anyway, So,
Yeah.
but I think for a lot of people, they don't, unfortunately, have and like we said before, that happy ending with their family or to their story. And it's a lot of it is finding that space within yourself to be able to, you know, not get over that shame, but to realize it as what it was, and being able to start to undo all those things that have been done in these conversion practices to just deplete your self-worth to the point where you were at that rock bottom point and you were just looking for anything that could give you some hope in the moment. For a lot of people, it's just starting that long road, and everyone is at a different place in the story on their journey, but being able to at least be working towards a better day in the future.
100%. Yeah, and I think that's the beautiful part about the collection is that again, although not all stories included in the collection, in fact, the majority do not include a happy ending, that we know again for the sheer fact that they've written the stories and are included in this collection that they have not only survived but they've thrived. Like they are now in a very different place and they are able to talk about their experiences. And for some of us, in those for some of the contributors, um, folks don't have a relationship with their parents or they haven't spoken to them since whenever. And I think that, yeah, for some people that is a wound, and for others, it's not. Like I remember when I came out, I knew my mom was going to be horrible. Like I knew she was going. I didn't know how horrible, and she certainly
Yeah.
exceeded my expectations. But it wasn't a surprise that she was going to be vitriolic and all of a sudden become a
Yeah.
Bible scholar herself after not reading the Bible ever. And that she was going to tell me how I was going to hell, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I remember the day after I came out, I woke up, I was going to work, I was teaching in Nashville. And I I woke up, I was in the shower. I think I literally, and I mean, I literally like shed one tear. And I only remember that because it was just not much was coming out of my eyes. And then finally I was just like, am I like forcing myself to cry? Like, am I feeling like I
Yeah.
should be mourning this? And I'm like, nah, I don't need to be crying. Like, I'm fine. I, and not to be like
Yeah.
the hero or to be sort of like, I'm a tough guy. Like, I'm not. Like, I cry a lot. But this was just like not expected, or it was totally expected. And
Yeah.
so for me, when in fact she, came out as, the homophobic, horrible mother that she showed herself to be, um, I was just kind of like, nah, like, I'm good. Like, I don't need her, and I don't need to have, any sort of like connection with this woman. And again, I kind of like waited a few months before I finally like cut things off. But I don't know. I think that a lot of people have the narrative that you have to be sort of like lament or grieve a parent who doesn't accept you. But I think for some of us, when you know that this is how it's going to turn out, and then they show themselves to be exactly who you expect them to be, it's kind of like
Yeah.
not that big of a deal. I don't know. For me, like I don't really miss my relationship with her because if in fact I can't have an authentic relationship, what do I miss? Like an inauthentic connection? No, like I mean, yeah, it'd be
Yeah.
nice to have a relationship with my mom in a certain sense, but if in fact my mom is who she is and this is how she shows herself to be, then I'm good.
Yeah, and I imagine as well when you've been through that period in your life where you were just trying to do everything to just repress who you are, going through these conversion practices, trying to just and going from that to a place where you're suddenly so free within yourself. It's very difficult when someone's still in that same place to now have a relationship when you've experienced that rejection if there's not been any change on their part. So I think a lot of people that go through these, conversion practices, conversion therapies, they come out of it and maybe, like you, their drive towards their religion is suddenly gone. Their relationship with their church, with their family, with their community as they knew it before is suddenly changed forever because it's the only way that they're going to be able to live with that authenticity. Otherwise, it's just a continuation of that performative life, and that just wears us down over time. If every day you've got to put on this mask, this straight mask that just feels so foreign, a concept, and just makes you suddenly shudder. And it's funny because many people will go from their queerness being the thing that they shudder about and they just want taken away to reaching that place of no, trying to be heteronormative just gives me the ick, as we say in the UK. It gives me the ick. And it's hard to still be around the same people if they're not going to now accept you as the authentic you and they just want the performative version.
I couldn't imagine A, going back into the closet, or B, just being straight in general. When we were younger, we all want to be straight. Like, no,
Yeah.
like I think we were made to believe that we wanted to be straight, but like, dear Lord, like I don't want to be bored with my life. You know what I mean? Like I thank you, but no thank you. I'm never like
Yeah.
that's never been my desire, or that has not been my desire for a very long time. And the idea of yeah, going into a closet or like having to like silence myself because oh, this person's religious, so I can't talk about certain things. No, that's not how I will ever live my life again. And I know that we wear, different masks or we present ourselves in different ways depending on our context. Like how I talk to my boss versus how I talk to my brother or my sister, like are going to be very
Yeah.
different ways. But like, I'm never going to make someone else feel comfortable simply because they can't deal with me being myself. That's never going to happen again. I
Yeah.
am a queer man. I will always be a queer man. And if someone feels uncomfortable, they can fuck off, right? Like
Yeah.
that's it's as simple as that. And I will never make someone else's happiness a I will never privilege someone else's happiness over and above my own. And not to say like, oh, I'm gonna like go out there with like throwing vicious bows and like clear the territory and sort of like make my
Yeah.
whatever, like sort of like center myself. That's not the point. In fact, I
Yeah.
do my best not to be, exactly that. But I will never just, shut up or be quiet or change who I am for someone else. It's just not gonna happen um ever again.
Yeah, and I think, there will be people, even with this book, that probably someone that comments on Twitter and says, look, I still believe in conversion therapy. Like, nothing you do is going to convince me. Members of our church or members of our community have had success against the same sex attraction. It always feels like such coded language that they use. But
It is.
you're always going to have those people. I think that the power of the book, like I said, is in those stories that people have just got to breathe and just say their experiences as it is, and say, this was messed up, what happened to me, this is where, you know, even if this is not where I'm at now, some of them are specific to that point in time. You have the authentic stories out there, you're doing something really great for the queer community. So you'll probably get some haters, but it's like, whatever.
Yeah, it's always that sort of, for me, it's always funny. Like I don't always think about what I'm doing ahead of time in the sense of like when the editor asked me, "Do you want to do this project?" I didn't think like, "Oh shoot, what happens if?" I was just like, "Yep, let's go, let's do it." And
Yeah.
so I just said yes.
Yeah.
But of course, but you're right, right? Like there's always going to be negative, there's always going to be haters, and so if they come along, then that's fine. You can't please everyone, and I'm not aiming to please everyone anymore, right? Like I think that
Yeah.
I used to be that sort of people pleaser, and in part why I even got into evangelicalism, why I remained an evangelical, all this kind of stuff. And I'm not looking to offend people just for the sake of offending people. I'm not looking to like ruffle feathers just for the sake of doing that. In fact, I hate conflict, I really do. But if need be,
Yeah.
I will, right? Like, and I think that this book is exactly that. It's going to piss people off. It's going to, um, you know, disrupt narratives that they are peddling as truth. And if that's the
Yeah.
case, then I'm down to clown to have conversations and perhaps difficult conversations, with people.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I just hope that these stories ultimately help those who have gone through, conversion practices. And like you said, if there's that one person who reads this and changes his or her their mind, then beautiful.
Yeah, I think that's the best mindset to have, and you're going to, like I said, you're going to probably have those people that do reach out. People might come to you with questions. Before we wrap up, if, for example, someone reached out to you and said, "Look, I'm still in a place where I'm considering conversion therapy of some sort," what would you say to them if someone reached out and they said, "Look, I'm still in this place where it's still something I'm considering"?
I mean, if we want to go in the academic route, or if we want to go the academic route, I mean, just to simply say that there's literally no research that suggests that conversion
Yeah.
practices are effective, right? There are a few studies by like really, what's the word? Folks who have no credentials, or if they do have credentials, they have discredited themselves in a number of ways. And, the scientific community has, looks upon those people who have published these quote unquote studies um, uh, in very negative terms. And so, although there might be again some quote unquote research, it's not credible research. And again, we can talk about methodology, we can talk about results, we can talk about biases, et cetera, et cetera. But there's no credible research that backs up that conversion
Yeah.
practices are effective. There's only research that backs up that conversion practices,
Yeah.
incredible research, I should say, that backs up that conversion practices are dangerous and damaging. If we want to think about I think it's the 2019 UN Rapporteur on torture,
Yeah.
references conversion practices as a form of torture. And so if that is the case and someone is looking for an effective means by which they can quote unquote overcome their same-sex attractions, there's no research to back this up. And so in the same way that you wouldn't take a pill where there's no research to back up its efficacy in regards to healing any sort of one specific ailment, you wouldn't submit yourself to practices that have no credible basis for working, or that have no research to back up that they work, or again, or especially if you have research that backs up that these practices are damaging. And so I think that would be my my way of addressing or responding to someone's desire to change.
Yeah. But I think, you can always hope that someone, like I said, that is maybe of that mindset where they are considering it, and we see all the time, like people will post on places like Reddit every day, like asking the question, like, I'm considering, going to conversion therapy. The hope is that they come across this book and someone's story resonates with them, or even it just strikes fear, whatever it is that just gets them not to do it and find their own path and learn to embrace who they are. That's ultimately, I think, the goal that you've got. And so for people to find the book, so where's the best places that we can find Shame, Sex, Attraction? And also for you as well, if someone wants to reach out with any questions that they have, where's the best place to find you to reach out with any questions?
So I think, we all know at this point Amazon's the devil, but Amazon nonetheless is perhaps the easiest place to find the book. There are certain countries like the US, like bookshop dot org. You can find it there, and there's like the Nile in Australia. But really, Amazon is ubiquitous, and so I would say Amazon. As for social media, I'm on Instagram, 𝐐𝐞 𝐐�𝐬 on Blue Sky, 𝐐𝐞 on Twitter, I am Wilson_FW. Otherwise, like Facebook, I think I'm Luke Wilson on there. And then, LinkedIn, you can find me Lucas Wilson. And so those will probably be the best places to find me online.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been, so great to pick your brain around, some questions that I had as well, but also to have this space to share with you to, talk about something that is so important. And I think 2025 is going to be a fantastic year for you. So thank you for, the work you're doing for the community and for giving a voice to all of these stories too.
Thank you, Connor, for having me, and I thank you for your super kind words. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much. And so to everyone who's tuned in, thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the Queerness Diaries, and we'll be back next Friday with another episode.